Thank you, Mac, and welcome to our viewers from the United States and overseas. The Foreign Policy Association's virtual events have become a staple of the country's foreign policy and national security conversation. It's an honor for me to introduce Major General John Kem, the 51st Commandant of the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, from where he joins me today. A slight change in program because it's customary in these events for the guest to be introduced by the president of the Foreign Policy Association, Mr. Noel Lateef. But Noel called me to report that an electric transformer in the Tyson's Corner area of Virginia, where he's riding out the pandemic, just caught fire. And so there's no electricity or the internet where he is. And he asked me to do the honors of introducing the general, and of course I'm thrilled to do so. In order to keep the introduction short, we have a lot of ground to cover. I'll just simply highlight General Kem's very distinguished career, and then you can read his complete biography on the FPA's website announcement of this event. Okay, so General Kem, as I mentioned, is the 51st Commandant of the U.S. Army War College. He was commissioned in 1985 through the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, where he graduated as a distinguished cadet, earned a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. He later earned a Master's of Science in Environmental Engineering and a Master's of Business Administration from the Kellogg Business School. He also has earned a Master's of Science in National Resource Management. He's a registered professional engineer in Virginia and a chartered financial analyst. So the important points I want to make is that Major General served as the first provost of the Army University, where he oversaw the reorganization of the Army's education enterprise into a university structure, maximizing efforts to achieve valid academic credit for soldiers' education and experience, consolidating and improving the curriculum and faculty development programs, and developing the Army University Press, which is the publishing arm of the Army University and includes Military Review, the NCO Journal, and Combat Studies Institute. I wanted to talk about that because for the last 3 years, General Kem has been running, transforming, and adapting the Army War College, which trains senior lieutenant colonels and colonels for a more strategic role. General Kem is a highly decorated officer. And again, General, let me say what an honor it is for the FPA and for me personally to have a chance to host you in this event. And please allow me to turn the platform over to you before we go ahead for any opening remarks that you might have.
Thanks for that introduction, Sarwar. And it's great to be on here today. I had a similar bad experience yesterday, very close to Tyson's. I had to go down to DC and I was on 270. Anybody who's been on that busy road, and tire blew out. I haven't had a tire blow out on my car and I don't think my whole life.
Oh my goodness.
Pulled over in 90-degree heat, changed the tire, put the spare on. I'm going to the next ramp to check the spare, and the spare blows. So I spent 4 hours on the side of the road in 90-degree heat yesterday. So this is a much better day.
And there weren't even any rocket-propelled grenades there, were there?
No, but I was baked by the end of the day, that's for sure. Thanks for the nice introduction. What I wanted to do, just take a minute or two and explain the War College and what they are. Many of you know, but the uniqueness of kind of the Army War College and what we do. We literally have about 2,000 students a year touch the War College in some way on the student side. And then we have our research arm, which I can also talk about if the time works out. The typical War College that people know of is lieutenant colonels to colonels and GS 13, 14, 15 interagency. We have about 30 of those a year. And then we get about 80 international students every year come in resident to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Out of 380 resident students, But then we also have a master's program accredited by Middle States in our distance education program, most inside the United States, typically National Guard, Reserve, and civilians, but a few overseas. And it's a 2-year program, very rigorous. And that's the main everyday classwork we do in teaching. But we also do the strategy course for the Army for all new strategists. And then all the executive education for general officers is really run from here. So we took that over about 4 years ago. So we run a course for 1 stars, 2 stars, 3 stars, and then some specialty courses for flag officers. So that's a little background on what we do here at Carlisle. The actual resident students that most people know of come here for about a year. So they typically arrive in late July. They're here as we speak. Our post is half filled with moving vans. We typically start in early August, and we can talk about COVID-19 separately in a minute. And then they finish in June. So only last month we got the last group graduated. Much harder to get them out into the world. Out of our 79 international graduates who graduated on June 8th, I think it was.
Wow.
We had 18 of them still here 2 weeks ago because it's really hard to get home. Examples, there's no fights in Mongolia. There's no fights in Nigeria. I think the officer coming here who just arrived, he had to drive into Benin to get here. And then you're flying through Paris or Frankfurt or Istanbul and all those countries, COVID, and then you get to the United States and restrictions. So it's exciting times for everybody.
Well, you say
finish there. We can go into it from there.
I know they say the Army is able to turn on a dime, right? But this is raising the bar quite a bit.
It is. It also shows you one last comment about the American people and our ability to absorb and be nice and appreciate people. So this community around here, people kind of live between Harrisburg and Carlisle, a little bit south, typically. Right. The way the schools in a typical year adopt those international students who come in, right? Some of them speaking very little English, some speaking a lot. Anybody who's moved to the United States knows getting a high school students credits to work in a different state
isn't
hard.
That nice?
Well, they do it. They come for a year. It is amazing. I remember 2 years ago, we had 2 officers. It's like one officer who came from a Middle Eastern country, and he came in, and I'm not going to talk about which country, but he had a son and a daughter, both at Carlisle High School as seniors. They arrived for their senior year.
Wow.
And I saw him, I got to know him a little bit, but I saw him in about April, and I'm like, what's going on? He goes, my kids just picked up their gowns today that they'll wear, and they were wearing them around the house. We all did this. And, you put your hat on and you got your tassel and you're twirling.
Yep.
And he was going, what an amazing year for my kids to go through this experience, which is very bit Americana. But they also, had a daughter and a son in a high school where you have boys and girls in the same high school. We all know how weird high school can be in the United States, but that didn't happen in their country. So they got to see a different part of the world in a very different way.
How great also for just the cultural introduction and making friends and, all of that. But, I wanted to ask you, the first time I came to the War College many years ago, General, the thing that amazed me was the mission, right, of the War College. And how, and I had a company then that I ran, and I said, this is quite amazing that the War College brings in all of these lieutenant colonels and colonels who have a much more tactical focus, and they convert them into strategic thinkers, into a pool from which the Army draws its leadership. And that transformation process, I think, A, is so difficult, but B, you people have innovated in that. And I just wonder if you might introduce that whole issue, that whole transformation issue to our listeners so that they have a better understanding of what their tax dollars are doing in this marvelous institution.
No, thanks for that question. It's interesting. So from when you were here, we have changed our mission a slight bit. I'll read it just for a second, but it's you would recognize it all. We just changed a few words. I might highlight that when I talk about that transition. But our mission is really to enhance national and global security by developing ideas and educating U.S. and international leaders to serve and lead at the strategic enterprise level. So the kind of changes when you were here was we added the word enterprise, because in the military, sometimes people get hung up on the tactical level of war, the operational level of war, and the strategic level of war. and they forget about the enterprise part, right? You're also running a very large corporation, for lack of a better term, not exactly
Indeed,
a corporation.
indeed, absolutely.
And a business, and it has to recruit and retain and do all those things. So we changed that part, and we've reinforced a little bit about highlighting the global and international part of it, because that's really what you're kind of implying is, but people who come here are lieutenant colonels. Typically, they just came out of battalion command. That means you were at the 18 to 20 years of service. You were just in charge of a formation of young men and women, typically between 200 and 800 people, depending on the type of unit, from engineers to infantry to artillery to logistics.
Right, right.
And you see most people every day. They kind of have to do what you tell them if you really order them to do something, right? There's a discipline to it. You know, you go to ranges, you train, you do a lot of stuff, but it's very direct leadership in most ways. And as you all know, when you move into the national security arena at more senior levels and global in things, no one's really in charge of anything. Right? No one owns it all. Right? A CEO or COO of a corporation has lots of authority within that corporation, but you're working with partners and allies and other people in your business world, right? The President of the United States has obviously great constitutional authority. But that doesn't mean, in our federal system, that doesn't give you all authorities, right? Internationally, you have to cooperate. NATO, you need every country to say yes to some things.
Indeed. So
we're trying to get them to understand you're moving to a level from tactical to strategic, and it's a very big leap. And the biggest leap is probably in, what's the right word? In uncertainty, because the uncertainty and the things you can control are so different. I sometimes, when I'm talking to the groups, use a quote from Mario Andretti, the old race car driver from, who gave up, stopped racing in the 80s, I think. And he had a line that said something like, if you feel like you're in control, you're not going fast enough. And his comment was, if you're in a race car and you're not going almost as fast as it's about to explode, the car is going so fast, you have no hope of winning, right?
Yep.
If the car is capable of 189 miles an hour, you better be going 188 or 189. And so the same thing applies in, I think, larger organizations. You can't control it all. You have to be a little comfortable with uncertainty is the only way to make an organization innovative and strategic. So we're trying to get them to make that leap. And we do lots of things to try to do it. I think the faculty would tell you, for them, about 60 to 70% make that leap pretty well. There's about 20% who never really make it. As much as you try, they're better for being here.
Wow.
They're smarter. They've studied. They've learned a lot. They're more knowledgeable. But whatever that magic is inside, they never quite get there. And we're not trying. I'll stop talking in a minute. But we're not trying to forget what you learned as a tactical leader. We're saying use that, but that's not sufficient going forward.
And that too, I suppose, is the real message for your level in the Army, right? That these people are superb at what they're doing at a tactical level. So there's nothing wrong with that, because as you say, not everybody makes it up there. But when you were talking about Mario Andretti's the quote, I couldn't help but think that maybe he got it from General Patton, right? Who kind of had the same mindset. If your tank is in control, you're not going fast enough.
Right. Absolutely. And just to give you a sense on the scale, one last comment. So the Army will bring in somewhere around 6,000 new lieutenants this year, the active Army. That doesn't even include Guard and Reserve. Around 6,000. In the end, 20 to 21 years later, a little under 400 will get selected for a war college. We're the largest of them in the Army.
Wow.
That's the Army. So that's a small number. And then of those, about 1% in the end will make flag officer, right? So that gives you a sense of it's a long run. And top 400 out of original 6,000 is a pretty tight group.
Right. But you bring in these people every year. You choose the lieutenant colonels, foreign fellows, other countries, and you put them into small groups. And I've had the privilege of getting to know some of your professors who just do such an extraordinary job of creating this camaraderie, but also getting people to open up, right? And that's the heart, as I understand it, of the training and education at the Army War Colleges, these groups into which they're divided. how do you make up for that, General, in this pandemic constrained atmosphere where you don't have people sitting next to one another, looking in each other's eyes, getting a measure of them, sometimes fierce arguments? Do you think you've been able to make up for that and you've adapted to that because you've had to take on that responsibility? It's been on your watch.
Yeah, well, let me comment. It's an interesting question. So we do use we call them seminars of about 16 people, a mix of a civilian or two, 2 or 3 international officers, some Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, because we're a joint school, and they come here and we spend a lot of time trying to organize that in a positive way, and really use a Socratic dialogue. Right? It's supposed to be safe space, but press questions, ask people hard questions, and that's how we work. And that really becomes a tight grip where you can really press and say things. In terms of the COVID world, it's actually, I'm not sure the answer yet. So in March, in our curriculum here, we tend to be in those seminars until about the 1st of April. In the last 2 months of school, we break out into different electives, and now we diversify those seminars. So literally like 3 days before the end of the term is when we started to have to go into remote learning. So we went into remote learning not in our seminars, but in our electives. So it's very different. So we're now been thinking, in the near term about how do we, so they were already in good groups, right? Because they had the face-to-face. Now, starting the second week of August, we brought those next 375 in, and we're trying to think through how do we build those connections. I would call it a hybrid world, because we have about 12 to 14 spaces that are big enough for 12 to 16 people to get together in a little more open way. But we know, that's not always possible. We know there may be times when we have to close it down, and if we have an outbreak, we might not be doing that at all, or the whole area might get worse and we'd have to go virtual. So we're going to start with an in-person the first week for a couple of days. Then the second week, do completely virtual. So we have tested both and learned from both. So we're ready to be adaptive, preferring to start. And third week, we'll start back in person as long as the conditions support it. But in a distance way, we've increased cleaning contracts, masks as you come in and out, those kind of things. So probably about August 20th before we give you a better answer.
So you've also obviously figured out a way to check the identification with the masked person coming in, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Well, let me ask you. I'm interested in explaining to our viewers how current events and changes when they take place find themselves into the Army War College's curriculum. And I mention this because you, unlike a lot of your predecessors, have had to face some really sensitive issues in the last 2 or 3 months before the pandemic, right? We've had this whole Black Lives Matter movement. We've had this emphasis on diversity. We've had this issue of protesters and soldiers, which affects the civil military connection. And I'm just wondering how these issues find themselves into these group discussions, into the seminars. Because, I mean, you're a university in many ways, and curriculums are set months in advance. But when something like this happens that is roiling the country or is entering the fabric of the nation, you have to react to that. So how does that happen? Do the professors bring that up? Do you call the leadership together and say, hey, listen, we need to react to this? Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm very interested, and I'm sure so will be a number of our viewers.
Sure, let me talk a little bit, and then you might need to do some sub-questions to see if I'm not quite getting at some of the parts you're trying to get at. In the end, like any university, we're trying to always improve. So this isn't something new. We've always, going back to 1903, early 1900s, there's been this sine curve of, are we focused on the last war and campaigning and lessons we didn't get right? Or how do you inform the future? And then we get guidance from the Joint Staff and the chairman. All the Joint Chiefs of Staff put together some learning areas, joint learning areas they want us to focus on. So we assess ourselves, and then we tweak it each year. I would call it the 3 to 5% difference in most years.
Right.
In recent years, we've tried to focus a little more on innovation and how we can create more innovative organizations as part of our learning. So that's like the generic year after year part. In the more near term, most seminars start, and this is true in the geo courses, it's true in the strategy and in the regular course here. Usually the first 15, 20, 25 minutes is a little bit of, I'll call it the seminar free time, for lack of a better term, where whatever's in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times that day, or what's bubbling in the news, or in some cases, the faculty the day or two before might say, hey, John, we're going to have you start the next class. You spend you go do a homework because we want to watch you work on your communication skills and come in and talk about either a lesson or a reading that was weird or hard or different, or it might be a new topic. Hey, what do you think about what we just read or heard might be a changing policy on, diversity and or what hangs in hallways or those things. And it puts a person on the spot in that safe space to talk, and then other people can comment. So you get a little bit of that seminar norming on, and it's you'd be surprised at the back and forth debate and the diversity of views.
I'm sure.
We create those organizations. We're all from the national security establishment, but we're looking for diversity of views because that's the only way you learn. And you certainly get that from international officers, right? It's easy in the, you get a U.S. military officer. We have a big military. We're the third largest country in the world. We're the only really global military in lots of ways.
Right.
So it's easy to kind of know our way because we can do a lot as a nation. Well, then you get somebody from Botswana or another small country, and they have a very interesting view, and they kind of call you on it a little bit, and they give you a view of what is it like to be a small country trying to cooperate with a big country, right?
Right.
And that's all feeds that diversity of views. It's not just race, creed, color, religion, gender. It's really it's all the things that make a society. And the last thing I'll comment, you can ask some follow-up questions if you want. It's about why I think the Army is a bit unique among the services. And it's really about, because we are, don't get me wrong, we love the Air Force, love the Navy, love the Marine Corps. They have unique missions in lots of ways, right? Who dominates the seas of the world, right? The United States Navy.
Correct.
The Air Force, manages the skies in a very dramatic way, right?
Exactly.
The Marines and their ability to be afloat and quickly put some assets ashore and those kind of things. But the Army, the first two are on ships and in airplanes, and then back at a base typically. There's always some units forward, but typically that's what they are. The Army is in the messy place, right? Where all the people are. It doesn't matter where it is, right? The Army is where the people are. The people are on land. So all the complexities of societies around the world, you go into any country, and I'll give you one, and it's hard, right? Because people are messy. And you love them, but they're messy. I'll give you one interesting example. We had a Saudi Arabian officer here about 2 years ago, and then they had a senior officer from Saudi Arabia, because we get, war colleges exchange visits and stuff like that.
Right.
And one of their senior generals came in, and we're talking about Yemen. And I said, we're in my office, hey, things aren't going so well. What are your thoughts? And he gave a very official answer, like the official history has not been written yet. I know. That's true. All of our countries are like that, right? But we, the uniformed people, have to make sure the next people who go into the battle or into the campaign or to go work in a humanitarian way have the right lessons. And he told me an interesting anecdote about a Saudi Arabian unit, some Yemenis unit they brought out to help retrain and do some different things with. So this is common language, fairly common culture, some civil or tribal nature, things like that. And they put him back in the country, and half of them changed sides within 2 months. Right? So he didn't go into detail, but you go like, that's how hard it is, right? People are hard business.
Yes, and everyone is different. Everyone has a personality, and you're dealing with a group of those. So, but I mean, the Army, as I recall it from the reading I've done, has been known in the United States as the up escalator for a lot of minorities and so on, right? I mean, you've done this successfully over the years, but one of the questions that come in has to do with this media headline that we are seeing these days is, in spite of all of that, that the top leadership of the military is overwhelmingly, I mean, you take this one black star, right? And so it's overwhelmingly white at that level. And I would like you to address that from the point of view, I mean, those of us who interact with military officers like you, I do understand how the pyramid narrows as it reaches the officer, senior, very senior officer level. And you look at the media headline that all doesn't quite come through. Can you address that a little bit and just talk about this narrowing pyramid and what that means to that question?
Sure, absolutely. So I mentioned before, about 6,000 lieutenants came in the Army. Maybe it was 7,000 in 1985 when I came in, because the Army was a little bigger then. I don't know. I've not looked up the most recent number. And the reality is, my experience is the boards and all the things that do promotion stuff are very professionally run. One of the hard parts is people go, well, you should reflect society in a certain way, but no one really gets into the details, right? I've already spoken more than a number of Twitter characters I can do. And so I'll give you an example. Right now in the Army, I think there's 7 4-star generals that are on the Army books. There's a few, there's Army billets, and then there's joint billets. And so an officer moves Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine into a joint billet, then that potentially opens up another one. But in principle, there's 7 that the Army kind of owns, I think, at this time. I didn't do the math this morning. And right now, as you correctly said, one of them, the Forces Command commander, is a black officer. So that's 1 out of 7. But in the Army, officer corps going back, remember, you got to be in the Army for 30 to 35 years
to get to that level,
competitive for 2, 3, and 4-star general, right?
Right.
And the branch you go into matters, right? So like an example, I'm an engineer. Out of my class at West Point of 1,000, I think 63, about 115 of us went engineers. There's no engineer 4-star generals. There hasn't been an engineer 4-star general since the 60s, because the 4-star general population is typically infantry, armor, a little bit of artillery, right? Most recently, a little bit of aviation. But if you're air defense and engineers and some of the other branches, there's been 0. So when I made my selection to be the branch I chose, and how that works, but I'd already decided that I wasn't going to be competing for that, right? So that's part of it. And then you get the selection of where do officers choose to go serve.
Right.
So if you're doing pure math in society, I haven't done the math. I'll probably get in trouble because someone will go do my math and accuse me of being a little off. But 1 out of 7 4-star generals being black is probably about in line with the population of officers who joined the military 30 years ago.
Right.
So big effort over the last 20, 30 years to increase the number who want to be commissioned and serve as officers.
Right.
And those numbers have gone up. I don't have them fresh on top of my head. I'll give you an example of female officers, because that's also an interesting one. I don't remember the exact number of female classmates I have from West Point, but for right now with the Army War College, right, where the students here graduated from West Point or RTC, different commissioning sources, or OCS, around 1998. Because it takes 20 to 21 or 22 years to get to the War College, depending on the person. So right now, West Point, I think, has just reached 25% female entering the class, a little over 25%. In 2000, I think it was only 13% or 14, right?
Wow.
And so that's who we just chose from. I think in the board I sat 2 years ago, I sat a selection board. 9% of the population was female lieutenant colonels eligible for the board, right?
Right.
And I think they were selected at either 10.5 or 11%. So they were picked at higher than their population. So the board didn't have a bias, I would argue, right? But they were only 9% of the pool, right? And so you can't go, well, why weren't they 50-50? Because they weren't 50-50 of the population who served for 22 years and is competing. We would all like it to be better. We'd like it to be more. It may never be 50-50, right? There's a propensity to serve. We don't draft you. We want you to sign up. And so you may never get 50-50. Is that bad? Not necessarily. As long as you have good opportunities, it's open, it's fair, people do get to have their choices, right? The number of, I'll give you one, the number of elementary school teachers in the United States by gender, I'm sure is 85 to 90% women.
Right.
So because the propensity to do it has changed, modified, morphed, and they more young women wanted to go in that than young men. So is that bad? I mean, probably good to have more men in elementary schools, right? That's a pretty far thing, but it isn't a negative bias thing. That makes sense.
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think the point that's embedded in what you're saying is that the career itself, the job description, if I might say, also has something to do with the numbers of people from different backgrounds that join, right? As you've said, the teacher, they're overwhelmingly women. But these are the kinds of shades which I think are very difficult to pick up, but one does wish that reporters in the media would do a little more research to explain the points that you've just made. But let me drill down on that just a little bit, because this is a question that has come up from the audience, and I'm going to mix my questions with the audiences as we go along, General. Sure. And this one says, that corporations at the top have all kinds of statements on diversity, but at the bottom level, where it really starts, there isn't the kind of broad-mindedness that one would expect to see. And so that's in the civilian world, I'm sure that it's in the military world. So in your courses at the War College, how do you address that? Do you remind the colonels that, hey, listen, you all are very sensitive to this whole issue of diversity, but do you look behind your shoulders in your command to make sure that you know what's happening down at the lower level where this thing starts? Is that a fair question?
No, it is. I think it's one of those ones. It kind of goes back to the first question you asked me about the transition to strategic leadership, right? It's more remote, right? In a way, you don't see everybody every day. So how does a leader get a sense of the pulse of the things that are going on that you don't see? When you're a general, people they're a little afraid of the rank, right? They're a little awestruck sometimes by it. So of course, when I show up to someplace, people are on their best behavior, right? But what's the behavior when you're not there, right? So, and then it's also been the force of time. So we try to get those colonels to also understand. It's even worse for generals. This isn't 1985. So your view of how you were as a lieutenant and how those units are is not exactly the same.
Right.
I would argue in many cases, it's actually very, very positive. And that's kind of the forcing function of the military unit when you have a mission, right? Very early on in basic training and in our officer courses at the tactical level, we try to make the group have to do something that's hard, because then you have to rely on each other left and right. We are a reflection of America. People do sign up and enlist and have biases, have prejudices, and you try to make the team understand wherever you came from is a bit immaterial, right? That's not the culture we want. And then when you force them together as a team and they do hard things, my experience is most of them kind of work through a lot of that. There's always some who can't, right?
Absolutely.
And over time, you identify them and you typically don't let them re-enlist, or they get a bad evaluation, or those kind of things happen, right? I'll give you, this is not related to diversity, but I had a soldier once working for me who kept stealing things. This was 20 years ago. And in the Army, we have these little levels of punishment, right? The company commander, the captain can give them and take a part of 1 month's pay or give them extra duty to try to correct behavior before it becomes legal behavior, right? It's non-judicial.
Yeah.
And then they can go to the battalion commander before you ever get into something more serious. Well, this soldier had done something like 3 times. He kept stealing things. They would punish him, took some money, and then he would be stealing things again.
Wow.
So I punished him once, and then he was back again 2 months later. And I'm sitting there with my first sergeant, my NCO, my bedrock NCO, and we're like, he came in and we talked, we sent him back out to think about it. And we basically said, he has to leave the Army because basically he had basically been taught by his parents, if you're not stealing, you're not trying.
Really?
I mean,
wow.
honest to God, you're like, well, that one, we can't really correct that, right? And it's not working.
Wow.
My camera just moved a little bit,
Wow.
but anyways, so I say that to you because it's kind of a highlight of
course.
I don't think our recruiters do an amazing job. And I think we reflect society in a pretty positive way. Sometimes it's not, people don't come in with a bad bias. They just having a lot of diverse experiences. Right. And that transcends gender, race, creed, religion. And when you get together as a team and you do something interesting, my experience is most do okay. The unit comes together. Right.
And in a sense, it's no different, right, from a very, very large corporation with, 250,000 people. You pick up the same sample of incoming as they do. And so you have to deal with this. But listen, there's a question that came in that I found very interesting, and I wanted to pop that to you. And so the question is, in your teaching at the Army War College, what kind of emphasis do you put on globalization, on international institutions? Because so much of what happens these days requires coordination between countries, coordination between people, coordination between armed forces. So how much emphasis is there on globalization and international institutions? How do you answer that?
Sure, yeah. Well, you noticed a little bit from when you came here for that NSS week. But,
yes.
We tend to use, it's not an exclusive lens, but one of the lenses we use is that the elements of national power come from diplomacy and information and military power and economic power. And there's more than that, but those are four pretty nice umbrella things. And they come together to help figure out that global and national security apparatus and the flows of money and all those things come together in order to achieve strategic aims, right?
Right.
You don't go to war, you don't compete economically. All those things are because the whole of government and then the international partnerships, international organizations, the international rule of law, all those things are part of the global commons. So in this leap to the strategic level, we spend lots of time on that here because they haven't had exposure to that, right? You've been in tactical units. You're pretty good at the M when you get picked for the War College. We want to shape it, but we also want you to think about how does the M interact with diplomacy and information, economics, and all those things to achieve effects that the nation wants or that the international body wants. And as I think your questioner is trying to ask, and we all know, like we said at the beginning, nothing happens in a vacuum. All those NGOs, international partnerships, other countries, all those have to work together to get anything done. And so we do spend a lot of time on that. That's also where our faculty is very useful because we have some true expert faculty who do research and work in those arenas. We have the Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute here in Carlisle Barracks that is uniquely linked up with USAID and the State Department and helps write stabilization doctrine, helps work with the UN on peacekeeping and trying to make peacekeeping better around the world using kind of our organizational approaches to help people think about it. So I think that's probably one of the hallmarks of the War College, because if it's easy, the decisions happen below you. When you get above, colonel and above, the chief of mission ambassadorial level, there's nothing easy, right?
Right.
Yeah, you might go cut the ribbon on a school someday, but most days it's really complicated.
Right. So this question I should have asked this question of you, General, but I was negligent. Army War College. It tells me that you teach about making war, but everything you've said is not about making war. What gives here?
I wish I'll get the quote slightly wrong, but there's a quote in the front of our building, and I just haven't looked at it in a couple of weeks. But General Eisenhower made the comment. I'll share it with you later. You can share it with the audience later if we get a chance. Where right inside our wall we have a plaque, and General Eisenhower had gone to War College in the early 20s in D.C. That's where the Army War College was then, and that's where the Industrial College of the Armed Forces was. But then, if you recall, after World War II, after he was president, he was also then lived up here in Gettysburg. So he would come and go, be part of here, and he spoke here a few times in those days. And he talked about that same transition. And he said, what's so important is you are here no longer to spend all your time about how to fight a war, but how to prevent wars, right? And be prepared if one starts. And you're now into things about national preparedness and strategic importance and all the things. You're not promoting war, right? Elihu Root, Secretary of War Root, when he founded the War College in the early 1900s, said, your purpose is to now help us not have to have wars. But if you aren't thinking about it, if you're not thinking about campaigns and national strategy and national policy and how the mix of all those economic power and military come together, you will be unprepared. Secretary Root did that because the U.S. was fairly unprepared for the Spanish-American War. So after they said, you know what? We have pretty good tactical units. We were unprepared for this mobilization and organization it takes to go do bigger efforts.
So here's another one that talks about headlines today, almost every day, talking about China becoming the with a capital T competitor. So the question, I guess, is what do you think about this? Is this a big item in your courses?
We do focus then that as I mentioned early on, we have the defense planning guidance and the national military strategy and those things that are kind of the strategic documents that come from the national security strategy of the United States and those things. And they change a little bit every 4 years. Typically, there's a new national security strategy. But if you go back and looked at the one, even though the words are slightly different from President Bush to President Clinton to George W. Bush president to President Obama, and even now, even though I would argue lots of people like to pontificate on TV with some of the nuances and changes, and some things have changed, right? China is a different nation in many ways than it was 15 years ago.
Indeed.
But taking China aside, the big things they talk about are very similar. Right? All of them, you go back and look at them. They change language, they change some nuance, but I would argue that 90% of them is really no different because the United States is a global power. We're engaged in the global commons. We got partners and partnerships and all these things. China, I think, is a bit as a challenge today, partially because of the economic connection we all have, and they're very dominant in lots of ways. If you look at economic flows in Asia, it's really hard for nations to, even though deep down inside they are afraid of China in many ways, afraid of their, kind of regional hegemony kind of thing. They're a little afraid of that. They also have an economic tie they can't ignore, right?
Right.
Far more money to them than to us. So they're kind of, that DIM&E part is really complicated for them.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's hard for us to recognize that. We spend a lot of time with our students to go, do you recognize the seat from where the person you're operating with is talking from? Right? You can't do it from your lens of Atlantic, Pacific, a global country like ourselves. They are not the same country. Vietnam's challenges, Malaysia's challenges, Botswana's challenges, Brazil's challenges are not the same as ours. Do you see the world from their view? We do wargaming. When I say wargaming, I don't mean the war part. Usually it's more about policy in wargaming, talking about those same challenges. So I think that's part of it. For the military side, I think it's a technological question also. You have a nation that's got lots of people. It has tremendous technical abilities, and there are things that they can do, and the things that we all rely on are very different than. I joined the Army in 1985. I graduated from West Point, right? Soviet Union. I was in Germany, Soviet Union, big unit, big armies, but and obviously big nuclear power. But things today that we have to rely on, global positioning system, isn't, and capital flows are so reliant on the web and data and all those things. And
right.
It's so much different than it used to be. And then I just give an example of space, right? No one, even though it might have been possible right now, does anybody think about the fact that people can actually manipulate satellites now? This is unclassified, right? You read on TV, right?
Yes.
We saw China, what was it, 4 years ago, destroyed one of their own satellites in space.
Indeed.
Why did they do that? Because they didn't like the satellite anymore? Right?
Right.
They were proving they could do it. They were signaling, right? So now that doesn't put just military units at risk in the old days, like my GPS is working, it's hard to move my tank around. That puts national economies at risk, right? So the dynamics is very different. And the last part I would say is it's probably much harder for our politicians going forward, all politicians. It's much harder for national command authorities at all nations to think about escalation and de-escalation, right?
Right.
You go read The Guns of August, right, from Barbara Tuchman talking about, and you go read from both World War I and World War II, as people were jockeying whether we're going to have a war or not in Europe, right? And then Japan and Germany in World War II, leaders were doing things, miscalculations. The United States hasn't really worried too much about miscalculations post-Soviet Union since about 1990, because we were, well, there aren't going to be that many miscalculations anymore, right? Some people thought that, right?
History has ended.
If a satellite stops working or disappears, right? Is that a miscalculation or is that intentional act? How do you know?
Yes.
How soon? What's the signal? It's
Yes.
really hard.
It is. It is. Thank you. This question has to do with force deployment. They're asking, what are your thoughts on the numbers of troops in different parts of the world, American troops, especially in the Middle East? Do you see lessening of troops anywhere, increase of troops anywhere? That's the question.
If you can look at it over time, there's an ebb of flow. There's always people. I'll get the number slightly wrong, but the Army probably has there's a couple thousand soldiers that are either physically assigned, living in South America somewhere, Central South America, or assigned in units that rotate in and out for training, for cooperation with other people.
Right.
And so there's always a decent number everywhere. The Army at any given day has more than 100,000 soldiers, either physically in or assigned to those places, right? And that's with only, typically less than 10,000 in Iraq or Afghanistan these days. It was even, at one point, you all know we had 100,000 in Iraq and later 100,000 in Afghanistan. But with those small numbers, we still have, because we're doing now pre-COVID, the last 3 months is a little different, but you have people living there, cooperating, working. Some places like South Korea, some places in the Middle East, you have forces stationed there. I don't think stationed lightly. In other words, we're not there for no reason, no purpose. They're in cooperative agreements with those nations. So and there's an ebb and flow that happens. So it tends to be, most places don't have a lot, like the Middle East, permanently stationed people, like we did in Germany when I moved there for 3 years when I was a lieutenant, right?
Right.
The CENTCOM, we tend to have units who come and go based on a mission set. Some are there permanently, more at the headquarters is at the big air base, few places. And then Afghanistan, Iraq, other places, we bring some people in and out based on the mission set. And every president ebbs and flows them. Congress has a role in all that, right? They fund it. And it's part of our national security kind of part. But again, I go back to my original one. I don't think those things change dramatically in many ways if you really look at it between administrations. I'll give you one small anecdote. I hope I don't get in trouble for it, but we lived in Germany in 2008. President Obama had just got elected, right? We had German friends. My son was going to German first and second grade. So we'd get together with them. And obviously they really like President Obama. He's a fairly new president. He just got the Nobel Prize, I think, or just been announced. And I made a comment to him. I said, President Obama is going to do many similar things in Iraq and Afghanistan that President George W. Bush did. And I think I don't know the exact numbers, but I read a stat somewhere that, more, it's kind of fake because it's media bias, right? There was more bombs dropped here than that. I've never done the real math to get the real data, but you would argue that every president has dropped a lot of bombs, right? Has authorized, I shouldn't say he dropped, they authorized the military to do a lot of activities in those countries. Right. And the Germans looked at me that meal like I was crazy, like, there's no way, he just got the Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm like, yeah, but he's the president of the United States, right? And we're a global nation. And so now he's getting those briefings. He and his national security apparatus are thinking about risks and risk of that and partnerships and all those things. And you kind of own it now. And that over time they do change. There's it'll diverge a little bit, but it's not like it's not as different as many people think, because we're a global nation and there are global interests inside our country. There are people who want more investment in every region of the world and every people.
And I guess what you're saying is, well, no matter who you are, once you enter the Oval Office, your mindset gets highly tuned to the country and your responsibility.
And who you think about the influencers inside the United States. There's a policy association. I don't mean like yours. I mean the barber hair cutters of America, and all those ones, all those interest groups, right, have forces and opponents. There's international companies in every country that would like more U.S. investment in that country.
Absolutely.
Right? Those are the ones influencing Congress, influencing the presidency, influencing all those things.
So here's a question. It says, how do we draw the line between protecting our interests and, protecting our interests and provocation, particularly in the South China Sea? So how do we draw the line between protecting our interests and provocation, particularly in the South China Sea?
No, that's hard. I should be asking the Foreign Policy Association that question. Right? Because we could have, if we were doing this at a pub, we could talk for 5 hours and never get that one fixed, right?
Yeah. I can put in a plug for my book, right? You get the answers, read my book.
It is I don't know. There's no answer to that, right? No. I think one of the hard parts, one of the challenges is if freedom of the seas and freedom of commerce that everybody's benefited from, right? And so sometimes you're not doing it to be provocative. You're doing it because we're supposed to be allowed to, right? But then in many ways, I think maybe the election year makes it worse, and then different people like to use the fact that a ship or a plane is going somewhere, not going somewhere for their own purposes, right? I would bet, I'd never done that. There's been a U.S. Navy ship has gone in just about everywhere in the world all the time, probably almost going back to Teddy Roosevelt and the Great White Fleet, other than during World War II, right? I mean,
indeed.
So now it gets quick media attention. People see it. No one even knew there was 20 years ago, no one even paid attention to a ship passing through the Straits of Malacca or something, right? Right. And now it's got to be used for some purpose. It's about sometimes agents of disorder, sometimes agents of, just wanting to highlight it. It's just because media attention, right? It's newsworthy. So I don't know how to answer that, because unless you're in another person's shoes, they might say it's provocative. Do they really think it is? Or are they using them saying it's provocative to be provocative, right? It's really complicated.
And also, I think, don't you, that part of the problem is that we live in an instant age, right? You see the ship going through the Malacca Straits, whereas previously you'd read about it 3 days later, and maybe you'd be able to better put it in perspective because you'd have read other things that were happening in the background. So yes, I totally agree with you. But let me, there's another question that I want to get out as we reach the end of our hour. And this one has to do with the changing nature of war, that this must be, the person says, a big subject at the Army War College. There used to be huge armies versus huge armies, and now you just have this amalgam of little green men, as we call the people without insignias in the Ukraine. You have armed intelligence people, you have special forces, and just your thoughts about how that changes the curriculum at the War College.
Yeah, well, that's another 5-hour one, right? The nature of war, the character of war is the perfect water cooler, coffee pot debate that goes on, and it's fascinating. A couple of things I would highlight. One is that's kind of why we focus on education, right? And I'll give you a quote from Lieutenant General Butler from 1907. Let me look down and read it. The nation that will insist on drawing a broad line of demarcation between the fighting man and the thinking man is liable to find its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards. Right? Now, granted, nowadays he would say fighting person, thinking person, right? He was early 1900s, but
Right.
But the same thing, right? We want, it takes all that establishment to come together to think about what we want to do. I think in many ways, from the military side, I don't think the little green men in uniform, the agents of disorder are in a military kind of way are as hard to deal with militarily. It's really a question for our security leaders, right? Congress, politicians. You think about the NATO example, Ukraine. I remember hearing a talk somebody going, well, it took us, we need to redo all of our stuff because it took us too long to figure out what those little green guys in Ukraine, who they were and what they were doing. Right. That's not true.
Right.
That day one, everybody goes, those are Russian, right? Maybe Ukrainians mixed in them, but we know they are Russians that took their patches off, right? We know exactly who they are, right? Now, but then in NATO arrangement, when you got to think through, what does it mean? How are we going to respond? Well, then you get in that, when I was talking earlier about the cycle of escalation, de-escalation, right? Nations are not dumb. Why would you want to trigger NATO or the United States wanting to do something? And you can ride that line just below threat of something bad happening.
Indeed.
And you get lots of advantages, right?
Indeed.
So, I mean, NATO could have said, we're going to do something about that, but then that's hard too, because what are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
And how are you going to do it? And who's got capacity? And so a lot of this, it's one of the things I think where the gaming we've been working on comes into play. Because now if you bring in, let's say, brand new leadership in Europe, NATO changes over, a bunch of country elections, and you come together and you bring, I'll call them assistant secretary levels of, war and commerce and treasury together, and you do a Europe NATO style war game in policy things. And you said, if this happened, what would you want? What would you think your country would want to do, or NATO should do? And making them talk about it, right? And then you throw the cards in and say, well, guess what? They just moved, this unit just did that, or Georgia just blew up. What are you going to do? And they got 15 minutes because you don't want to take forever to then, but they can't just, it's not moving a little brisk board. You have to say what you're going to do and explain what you're going to do so everybody else can go like, well, who gave you authority to do that?
Indeed.
Who has to say yes? So that's the hard part. I think it's about it's agile adaptive thinkers and thinking we have to think through our rule sets because the way you would do things in the past is not sufficient in a time way now.
Hey, listen, I'm going to commit a court-martial worthy offense and interrupt you and say we have a couple of minutes. And I wanted to give you an opportunity just to tell us, you've had a chance now to work through some really tough issues. What are you leaving behind for your successor? What message would you give them? And if you don't mind ending, I just want you to give a shout out to people who are considering joining the Army and just saying, hey, come on in, we need you. So
thanks. In fact, let me start with, that's great.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. Let me start with that because in June, I got to do I did two commissioning ceremonies for officers. And then a week before that, over at the Army Heritage Center here in Carlisle, one off the highway, that I think is the second most visited place in Pennsylvania, pre-COVID. I got to do the oath of enlistment for about 35 Pennsylvania young men and women, 18 to 22 years old or so they all were, who came from really within 150 miles of here for that ceremony. Wow. And it was amazing to see, and they were excited about what military specialty they had and why they were doing it. Very diverse group, and it's just a great way to serve your country. And I've done some funerals for fallen soldiers, been to funerals for veterans more than a few times in the last 15 years. You go to those things and you'll see the old Vietnam, the grizzled Vietnam veteran, right? Often motorcycle, caravan for the funeral. Right, for a Vietnam vet, you talk to them, even those that got drafted and served a year, they to this day are like, I wouldn't change a thing. Didn't like some of it, right? They are so happy and proud of what they did.
Wow.
So that's just a powerful part of that. I think for me, it's a great privilege to be the Commandant of the War College because you get to, having done tactical things all my career, you get to rise up to a different level and engage in a much wider public audience, which is fun. It's messier. That's where the problems really are hard. So I've enjoyed that part. I think here at the War College, I think one of the parts that I'm probably most proud about is trying to get a little more entrepreneurial spirit in terms of trying new things. Because we do have a lot of academics, I said in a positive way, but often when you're a PhD researcher and this or that, you want, as you study, medical is the best example. You got to prove that COVID-19 isn't going to kill the patient before you give them the vaccine, right? That's very important, right? We're all for that. You don't have to prove the success of a change in curriculum to the same level, right?
Yes.
It's not as catastrophic. If we're not going to be that far off. It's not going to be we're not going to kill the patient, right? So how do you take a few more risks, informed risks? So I think that's one of the parts that I'm probably most proud of, is trying to be a little more adaptive and go see who else is doing interesting things in this space. We should be way out on the leading edge of the learning curve with whoever is pushing the envelope.
Well, it just remains for me to say it has been a personal privilege to spend this time with you. And you're very nice to take time from all your official duties and spend so much time with us. There was a lot of interest in your appearing on this Foreign Policy Association program. And as you know, the FPA is a totally nonpartisan organization, but it's a privilege to have people like you because, there are lots of corporate and educational decision makers here. And I think what you've said will let us think for a long time. So I want to wish you the very best and look forward to coming and seeing the college again at some point and meeting you in person. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's
been great being here today.
Absolute pleasure. So we just
thanks everybody. Thanks for dialing in.
Well, thank you all for listening.